Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Network for Landscape Conservation's Landscape Conservation in Action webinar series. My name is Kat Lyons, and I work as the Network Associate for NLC. I'm going to share a brief welcome from the network, introduce our wonderful speaker today, and then go through some housekeeping logistics as we go through the webinar. So a brief overview of the network. We launched in 2011, and the Network for Landscape Conservation is really a national umbrella group and leading voice for advancing collaborative landscape conservation. We really strive to connect people to ideas and innovations and to each other. And we really consider the network a community as much as an organization, a community that's connected by a shared work of collaborative landscape conservation. We really strive to create opportunities for the community to learn together. And for this reason, we are extremely excited to continue this webinar series throughout the spring. So today I get to introduce Dr. Healy Hamilton, the Chief Scientist for NatureServe. She is a biodiversity scientist with a graduate degree from Yale and the University of California, Berkeley, and an extensive field experience in the tropical forests of Latin America. At NatureServe, Dr. Hamilton leads a staff with expertise in ecology, zoology, botany, conservation, data science, and information management. And together they deliver foundational information on the distribution, conservation status, and trends of species and their habitats. She is also a world expert on the taxonomy and evolution of seahorses and their relatives. And Dr. Hamilton is an elected executive committee member of the IUCN US National Committee, an honorary fellow of the World Conservation Monitoring Center, and a contributor to the IUCN Species Survival Commission for Seahorses and Pipefish, and a member of the Key Biodiversity Areas Committee. So right before I hand this off, just a few logistics, and then we'll get to the amazing content that Dr. Hamilton has for us. As we listen to the presenter, please submit your questions in the chat or the Q&A function on the bottom of the screen. And once the presenter is done, we'll be using the remaining 15 minutes or so for questions and answers. So with that, I'll welcome Dr. Hamilton to present. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Kat, for that kind introduction, and to Gary Tabor and Kat for the kind the invitation to have the opportunity to speak, particularly in this venue. Many of you are friends and colleagues. I remember when the network launched over a decade ago now, and I think as an umbrella organization trying to bring data technology and innovations to your community, that's very parallel to NatureServe as the umbrella of the Natural Heritage Network, trying to bring data and solutions to similar communities. So really an honor to be here. Thank you so much. It's great timing as well. NatureServe has been releasing some new national scale products, spatial data products on imperiled species and ecosystems, and that we want this community to understand that they exist and how they might be useful to you. I have a lot of material to cover today, trying to bring you sort of some case studies of how this information might apply in your landscape. So I cut the name of the title down a little bit to Imperiled Species Distributions and Landscape Conservation in the Geography of Our Focus, which is the Conterminous US. But I wanted to make sure that you all knew about a lot of our ecosystems data as well, because that's not quite as well known as our species data. So I threw some ecosystem examples in as well. So really, this is an opportunity that I respect and appreciate very much. And I want to start off kind of setting the stage globally, nationally, regionally for where we are sort of at this moment in conservation. And I'm going to start off with a World Economic Forum report. So going to the business community to help us understand how much right now we are at a moment in time where the business community is really waking up to the value and the potential impact of the loss of biodiversity. So this graph is published annually in the Global Risks Report. And from last year, this graph on the vertical axis, you have impact from low to high, and the horizontal axis, you have likelihood from low to high. And we're looking, hopefully you can all see this here, we're looking at things like all kinds of potential impacts that could be risks to the global business community. And what is quite astonishing is to see that biodiversity loss has both a high likelihood, according to this report, and a high impact, according to this report. So the World Economic Forum calling out just how important biodiversity is to the business sector. They've started a whole new information series that they call the New Nature Economy, talking about risks and challenges to biodiversity conservation and how much it matters for business and the economy. These are movements that are helping us in our ability to engage the corporate sector, argue for the wide range of values of conservation. And we're seeing this message percolate throughout this corporate community, right? So I'm just grabbing a few headlines and report titles here to give you the sense of how much we are seeing an awakening to what many of us have known for a very long time, that the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the natural world on this planet, and that they are intertwined, and that message is getting across, and it affects our ability to do our jobs as conservationists in a positive way, especially if we're aware of it and we take advantage of it. It's not just the corporate sector. We also are seeing international governments. It was just a couple weeks ago that almost every government in the world was meeting in Geneva to hammer out what are the global conservation targets going to be for the next decades and to mid-century, for the 2020s and up into the 2050s. And they're working out all kinds of conventions and agreements, such as the Sustainable Development Goals and the targets and how we track them, looking at desertification, looking at migratory species, looking at the Convention on Biological Diversity. These are all multinational efforts that are setting the stage for an increasing effort in conservation. And I just want us to quickly recognize that it's not just about having targets that we set for ourselves for regional, national, or global conservation. It's also our ability to measure our progress towards those targets. And we do live in a time of paradox that I think is a unique responsibility to our community, that we have tons and tons of data, more data than we've ever had before. And yet we are not delivering that information in ways that allow responsible agencies or governments or international agreements to easily be able to track our progress towards the targets that we make. So something that we need to keep in mind as we see our own national targets moving forward, targets such as 30 by 30. Right, so we know that 30 by 30 can't just be a pure acres target, because you can cover 30% of our country and still leave a huge amount of the important biodiversity and ecosystem function outside of that target. So as we move to set targets of where are species and ecosystems most important for achieving a 30 by 30 goal, that goal includes, increased access to traditionally underrepresented populations. We need to make sure that we are delivering information that can show measurements toward the progress of the targets that we set. And that is a sort of a unique responsibility of our community to have to help the agencies behind many of these targets show that we can be successful. So we have 30 by 30 in California as sort of leading the way for the nation, having already set up a whole bunch of definitions of what does it mean? Like where do we prioritize these essentially irreversible land acquisitions? Where are we enhancing conservation that already exists? Where are we investing in restoration of ecosystems? Those locations come with data underneath them that can be measurable. And that's an important aspect of what I want to convey. We have this incredible opportunity of the 2025 state wildlife action plans that are currently under development, or in many states. They're due in a few years, and they're massive tomes that require years of effort to set clear priorities for conservation, to be able to identify which are the species in each state of greatest need of conservation attention and their habitats, and what are the actions that are necessary to sustain and restore those species and ecosystems. And they are mandated by Congress every 10 years. And the states are gearing up for version 3 in 2025 at a time, the first time ever, when we have national conservation targets. So what an extraordinary opportunity we have at this moment in time in our country with all of this federal and state activity towards defining conservation targets and setting up to implement them. And of course, the state wildlife action plans have even more heft to them now because of the potential of RAWA passing, the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, which has recently moved out of committee. Sure, there's a long way left to go, but should this act be passed, it provides over $1 billion a year, billion with a B, to implement those state wildlife action plans. So the combination of those plans being due in 2025 as we're trying to strive toward these national conservation goals, and the opportunity that RAWA represents of funding to behind those plans, this really is an incredible moment in conservation in our country. And landscape conservation, the role of landscape conservation has been clearly recognized. So these are just the titles of 2 recent resolutions passed by the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies at the sort of the highest levels of AFWA that are leading, that are asking the states, requesting the states to operate more at landscape scales, and recognizing that the next version of state wildlife action plans need to do a better job of looking outside their borders rather than standing at their borders and looking in. And so what can our community do to support that? And those states are actually on their way to doing that already. These are just 2 different graphics of regional species of greatest conservation need, recently identified by the Midwest Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies on the left, a few years ago, determined by the Southeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies in the Southeast. What are our regional species of concern? A dramatic reduction from just each state looking at their own SGCNs and crossing borders and asking, what are our regional conservation priorities? So states are responding to providing the data that is needed for transboundary landscape scale conservation. And there are other data products that have been generated as well, right? The Northeast terrestrial habitat map, local connectedness maps, like these maps that help us on a regional scale, the states with their swaps and ourselves also sort of the underpinning, if you will, of landscape conservation. And perhaps the most advanced landscape conservation covering a huge part of the Southeast has been the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, or CCAS, where that's been enormously supported by Fish and Wildlife Service, tons of involvement from different sectors, outlining here in the darkest blue where a whole community of stakeholders has determined the highest conservation value, and then the lighter blue, the medium conservation value. So really kind of giving us, working to provide some of that foundational information that can help states and federal agencies and all of us reach our conservation goals at scale. So just to set the stage, right, there's really this increasing recognition of the many values of biodiversity, both from the public sector and the private sector, perhaps more recognition than we have ever previously had. And sort of the demand for the conservation response is also increasing, right? And for that conservation response to function at landscape scales, those demands are increasing. And we are seeing at regional, national, and global scales sort of unprecedented commitments that really should lead to ramping up landscape conservation. But I want to make the point that underpinning all of these regional conservation prioritization efforts, right, underlying our ability to set effective national and global conservation targets that both deliver on the goal of conserving life's integrity, but also that provide measurable like metrics that we can use to measure if our conservation actions are having the intended impact. Sort of underpinning as inputs are models for connectivity, for ecological integrity, for resilience analyses. Underpinning a lot of it is the identity, distribution, and conservation status of species and ecosystems. This is the type of data that NatureServe generates and curates and analyzes and shares. And I'm going to sort of, with that background stage setting, I'm going to spend the rest of my time sharing data on basically classification, distribution, and conservation status of species and ecosystems, and how those examples relate to landscape conservation in the lower 48 states. I just want to very quickly just talk a little bit about NatureServe and what the network is, just a few slides for those of you who may not know. That we date back all the way to the early 1970s, at a time when our nation was passing all kinds of landmark environmental acts, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and the Endangered Species Act. And back then, as the science division of the Nature Conservancy, scientists there recognized that we've got to start generating nationally consistent data so that we have a way to actually implement the legislation that we've just been successful in passing. So recognizing this need to discover and document and understand biodiversity in order to protect it and conserve it, the scientists at the Nature Conservancy conceive of this network of what are called state natural heritage programs. And kind of unbelievably, because it'd be hard to imagine doing this today, within 15 years, an entire national network of programs were stood up, one in every state, also Navajo Nation, also Tennessee Valley Authority, eventually moving to every province in Canada. And this is a network that was tasked with developing foundational information on species and ecosystem within their jurisdictions, but using the same methods, the same data standards, and the same biodiversity data management system. And that is the NatureServe network today. So in 2000, we spun off from TNC as an independent organization. And as a network of over 1,000 scientists, we record and compile and analyze and share high quality information on what species and ecosystems are present, where do they occur, and how they are doing, and what actions we can take to conserve them. So this very foundational data, much of it is spatially explicit. Many of you have heard of element occurrences, which is the data observation standard for the NatureServe network. So spatially explicit polygons delineating actual populations or areas of conservation significance for a given taxon. So we've amassed almost 1 million mapped occurrences of species and ecosystems in our country with a lot of metadata. These really have high conservation value, high information value in this compiled sort of aggregated data set. The fact that we undertake these conservation status assessments allows us to roll up across the whole country and say for thousands of taxa, including mussels and crayfish and pollinators and plants, like a lot, not just vertebrates, for lots of taxa, that really capturing the diversity of taxa in our country, what is the extent to which they are at risk? So many of you are familiar with NatureServe's global conservation status ranks, a 5-point scale where G1 is globally critically imperiled, going down to G5, which is globally secure. And we have applied a quantitative, objective approach to conducting conservation status assessments to tens of thousands of species and ecosystems. And that rolls up to allow us to understand what elements of biodiversity in our country are in fact imperiled. And so this is just a snapshot for all taxa and for some subsets of taxa like cacti and orchids. Here really showing that freshwater invertebrates, almost 50% of them are either critically imperiled, or vulnerable. Really one of the most imperiled taxonomic groups in our country. And that cacti specifically are doing much worse than plants overall. So that kind of foundational information is absolutely essential. We give most of it away freely on NatureServe Explorer, which was redesigned in 2020. And I'm highlighting this also in part because notice here that we have an ecosystems button. So when we relaunched NatureServe Explorer in 2022, we now have access to ecosystem data. And so with that background, I am going to actually show you some of our ecosystem data and how it might relate to some of your landscape conservation efforts, how it might help inform them. So let's go to the historic distribution of grasslands in our country, right? I mean, ecosystems being that coarse filter for conservation and often the actual unit that we manage, even if our management actions are targeted at species. We're focusing on grasslands here because it is the most transformed of all the major ecosystem types in our country. And we're looking here at the modeled historical extent of grassland vegetation types. There's quite a few types, just to give you an idea of all the different vegetation assemblages, mostly the short grass and tall grass and mixed grass prairies that used to cover the vast swath of the interior of our country. And then looking at what is left today. So just, able to kind of go back and forth to what we inherited in, say, pre-Columbian times, which is the time frame of this historical analysis, versus where we are today. And there's a lot of grassland left, right? Of what's left, can we rank it in some way? So here we're looking at the grasslands that remain, and we're asking ourselves, of those that remain, what % of the original extent is that? How imperiled is this ecosystem? So we're able to show, well, so everywhere that there is red, that ecosystem was, that vegetation type was much more prevalent, 90% or more of it is lost. And so if ecological representation is a conservation goal, this is helping us understand our grassland ecosystem conservation goals, to understand what is the % that we have lost, a critical factor in considering its imperilment. And just to take you a little bit more deeply into how does this look in one state. So for anyone who's working in Kansas, you might think about your landscape conservation project in this context. So Kansas was covered by grasslands. Historically, it's been greatly reduced, but there is in fact a lot of grassland left in Kansas and a lot of Midwestern grassland conservation initiatives underway. And so again, looking now more closely just at one state, of those grasslands that are left, what do they represent of what was originally part of our the natural heritage that we inherited at pre-Columbian time? So this type of information about this fundamental information, classifying these different grassland types, documenting their historical and current distributions, understanding the degree to which they have lost their original extent, which helps us understand their conservation status, absolutely fundamental if we think about how do we prioritize landscape conservation and we think about goals of ecological representation. So now I just wanted to throw a little bit in there about ecosystems, and I'm going to turn to the really the main intention of this presentation, which is to share with you some of the refined species distribution mapping that NatureServe has been undertaking for imperiled species, and to show you how some examples, some case studies of how that might apply to the landscapes in which you are trying to undertake large conservation efforts. So we're going to go to, this is New Mexico. We're going to New Mexico, and I'm just going to show you an example of why individual species distributions at high resolution for imperiled species are just so important for us to have at this point in time. So we're actually going to the BLM field district in southeastern New Mexico, and this is the reality. This is the oil and natural gas well distribution in this area. So you are a BLM steward of our public lands in this area, and you're getting a lot of permit requests for oil and gas drilling. Also in this exact same area are 6 imperiled plants. 4 of them are globally critically imperiled. A couple are globally imperiled. All of them are of concern to BLM because they co-occur in this region to the best of our knowledge, and we don't really know what their true distributions are. And so making decisions about oil and gas placement when we don't know where these imperiled species are found was causing BLM a lot of concern in the area. So we're going to focus just as a case study on this one particular Justicia rhytii, this one particular plant whose common name is Wright's water willow, although it's not related to willows and it doesn't live near water. So we're looking at what the known localities were. So where surveys had been conducted, these yellow dots show us the distribution of Justicia rhytii right in the middle of all of this oil and gas development. And these surveys were all that was really known about where this taxon occurs. So you can see the reason for concern. So what we did is we took the known localities, some of which were from the New Mexico Natural Heritage Program, others which were from BLM field surveys, and we created a species distribution model or an ecological niche model, or what we are calling species habitat models. So here you are looking at a model where low probability of suitable habitat is in the yellow colors, and the higher probability of suitable habitat gets into the darker and darker green. I'm not going to go into methodological details on distribution modeling. Happy to do that another time. But then, so in producing these models, we are then doing our best to test them in the field. So we come up with a test of the model in the field by generating a structured field survey where we can test both predicted presence and predicted absence. And I'm just going to zoom in so we can see more clearly that we go into a particular area in the field around Carlsbad. The black squares are where we're going to go test in the field. And we were successful in this case. The orange dots are the known populations we started out with. The blue stars are newly identified populations because a species habitat model provides essentially a hypothesis that can guide field inventory. So in the field inventory, New Mexico Natural Heritage found the blue star populations, BLM ID'd the pink star populations. And then we took the presence absence information from this testing and we were able to generate a revised model that BLM, so now we're on model version 2.0 after it's been field tested. And BLM feels relatively comfortable using this as a map in its decision-making. And it's one that we can now ask, we've now added, well, how protected is this imperiled taxon? So we've added this green area here to just ask the US Protected Areas Database, well, where is gap status 1 and 2 lands in this area? And as it turns out, just a few percentage point, like a small part of the area of this taxon is covered under gap status 1 and 2 lands. We're going to zoom in to this particular area. It's been very productive from a habitat modeling. We only had a few occurrences in the orange originally, but we've found a lot of new populations in this area. And so we're asking ourselves, how protected is it? A really important question to be asking. But as it turns out, now we've added multiple use lands, gap status 3 lands. And the almost half of Justicia rhytii's distribution, as we have identified it, fall in gap 3 lands. And this type of spatial biodiversity analysis, this can provide a science-based foundation for some of the strategies that we are now facing as a country, right? Where do we consider transitioning lands, public lands that are currently designated for multiple use, into lands that are more focused on biodiversity conservation? If we want to prevent fragmentation or restore ecological integrity or prevent extinction, right? 30 by 30 is going to drive questions like this. And we're going to have to respond with the confidence in our underlying information to be able to make decisions about where do we add protections. And we want that to be a science-based process. And this is one approach to getting there when the conservation value is preventing extinction of imperiled species. So one more quick example. Also, just by total coincidence, you guys, this also happens to be an example in New Mexico. Now we're going to the Forest Service. And we're going to the Lincoln National Forest in southeastern, so south central New Mexico. And we're just going to create outlines for the boundaries of this relatively complicated shape that is the Lincoln National Forest, so that we can see what happens when we map imperiled species distributions, again, using species habitat modeling. Here's a globally critically imperiled bumblebee. We know we're all very concerned about pollinators these days, and we're looking at its distribution based on modeled outputs, and how much that falls squarely in the largest block of the Lincoln National Forest. Just sort of closing it, giving you a close-up here so you can see these results. Then we're going to ask about the golden bladder pod, which is actually listed endangered, which also largely has a habitat falling within the Lincoln National Forest. This is a ESA listed threatened taxon, globally critically imperiled plant, also falling within the Lincoln National Forest section. Here's another G2 plant. It's not currently on the ESA, but it's one that's also falling in this area. We can move to a cute little cottontail rabbit. This is actually a proxy photo. This is not Sylvolagus cognatus because it's so poorly known, I couldn't find a verified photo. So the proxy cottontail, this is a G2, so globally imperiled taxon that also has a large amount of distribution in this forest. All of these are taxa that we have modeled as having distribution in the Lincoln National Forest that are either globally critically imperiled or globally imperiled. And so we can stack all those up on one another, and we can create heat maps of imperiled species distributions that can help guide the management of the Lincoln National Forest. Now, as it turns out, that entire upside down Pac-Man shaped blob that is the hottest of the hot spot in the Lincoln National Forest, that entire blob is not GAP 1 or 2. It is currently multiple use lands. And so again, as we're trying to make these decisions about where are we conserving biodiversity and why, this type of data can feed into the decisions that we need to make, even if it's just to help in convening the collaborative conversation we need to have, because we fully recognize this is just one value. This is the value of protecting imperiled species from going extinct. There are many, many conservation values that need to factor into our conversations, but this is the one that is the most legislated, the most regulated, the one that 50 years ago, we agreed as a nation that we want to conserve our natural heritage and not be the stewards of extinction. So NatureServe has really been doubling down on species habitat modeling in a very large way. Some of you are aware that we recently published in the journal Ecological Applications the results of this project, which was to generate species habitat models for all globally critically imperiled, so all G1 and all G2 and all ESA listed full species for a whole suite of biodiversity in our country, 2,216 species, including over 1,600 of which were vascular plants, all the vertebrate groups of birds, mammals, amphibians, reptiles, and freshwater fishes, over 200 crayfishes and mussels to represent the really important freshwater biodiversity in our country, several groups of pollinating insects, and we were able to generate species habitat models for all of them, and using using some tools that we have produced, we tried to include as many heritage biologists in our network to review and help us edit those models so that they really did represent an intersection of machine learning and human expertise. So the link on the left, the image on the left is to the open source publication in Ecological Applications. And then I'm very proud to say that biodiversity mapping made it into the New York Times last month, and the paper in Ecological Applications was picked up and highlighted with some beautiful cartography by the New York Times. So this is what a couple of those maps look like. So sort of stacked up on one another. And what we have here is really an unprecedented spatial resolution and taxonomic diversity, highlighting where hotspots of imperiled species occur in the lower 48 states. And just to sort of zoom in a little bit to the southeastern US, for example, this is a subset looking at just aquatic invertebrates, and you can see like watersheds and even individual stream reaches where we're looking at multiple co-occurring range-restricted imperiled freshwater invertebrate taxa. And some of you may know that on a global scale, for freshwater biodiversity, the US is almost like a tropical rainforest. I mean, we have a huge responsibility for a very rich and diverse taxonomic group in the southeastern US. I'm looking again at the southeastern US here for plants. It's a hot spot for plant diversity. And so here we're looking at those maps stacked up on one another. And of course, there are certain areas that are not surprises, but we're trying to aggregate information that has been either highly dispersed, hasn't existed, been at lower resolution, hasn't included the diversity of taxa that we have included here. The map of biodiversity importance is, yes, it is a set of products. There are 15 maps publicly available, freely available on Esri's Living Atlas. But we've also built it as a process. We're committed to this as a process moving forward. So these are not static maps. They will be updated regularly. And we've built this whole process to be extremely efficient about species habitat modeling, but also to be participatory about it. So we begin with our species occurrence data. We've created, we need environmental predictor data that gives us information about the environment at high spatial scale. We submit those to machine learning algorithms. We've scripted everything and placed everything everything is in the cloud to make it a very efficient process that has come with support from Microsoft's AI for Earth initiative. Once we have modeled products, sort of step number 4 here, we've built tools for expert review. So you can actually review the modeled products. You can drop your own occurrence records onto the model. You can give us feedback on the model inputs. You can tell us where we've overpredicted or underpredicted. So we're capturing people's expertise and their response to the models, and we can track how the model changes based on people's input. So we're taking modeling out of the black box and trying to make it a more open and participatory process, so that the final distribution map that we're using in the end is not something that somebody told you to use, but something that you actually see yourself or your network or your trusted sort of experts in. Just showing you a few of the beautiful maps of our country, looking at different environmental predictors. We have a library of over 250 of these, many for over 100 for the terrestrial environment, over 150 for aquatic environments. We developed standards that help us assess what the quality of the model is and what types of decisions it is fit for purpose. So all kinds of decisions that are made along the way to a distribution model. And we've sort of said, okay, if you take this approach, it's problematic. If you take this approach, that's acceptable. But if you take this approach, that's ideal. So that allows us to be able to assess the confidence we have in models. And we've translated that into our own habitat modeling standard that we have now for the whole NatureServe network. So we're generating these standardized products, managing them in common frameworks, assigning confidence scores to them using objective sets of techniques. For the sake of time, I'm not going to demo the model input review tool or the model output review tool, but both of these are tools that we've built that allow that level of engagement of experts. And I just was on a call before this with the Fish and Wildlife Service, where we're going to look at a couple, working with species biologists that are looking at listed species and seeing if we can't help to generate what Fish and Wildlife Service is calling these one range maps to refine some of these mapped products that previously have been either blob range maps or often at county boundaries. So once you have them, you can do some really cool things, and we've generated some scripts that allow us to sort of spit out reports. So for example, here is Silvery Phacelia. It's found that our high probability habitat model has it found along the, there's no locator map here, but you're at the northern coast of California and the central coast of Oregon. And so we can say automatically, well, what proportion of its range is protected? That's shown here in the donut chart on the dark green. We can also say automatically, well, whose responsibility is it? This shows that the red is state forests, the dark green is private. So this is really a state issue. The federal agencies don't have a giant role here. It helps us understand who are our partners in the shared conservation stewardship that is required for preventing imperiled taxa from further decline. So in the next 8 minutes or so, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of the application of this information to landscape conservation. Here we're going to look at landscape conservation design that has been developed by the state of Virginia's Department of Conservation and Recreation. We're looking at just one of many layers they've put together, but this depicts essentially their network. They've identified core areas and corridors. They've parsed them into ranks of 1 to 5, and the 1 and 2 are the dark green, 3 to 5 are the light green. We don't care, we're just going to call this whole thing an important network, and we turned it white so that we can add other layers to it. So the white is the state of Virginia's conservation landscape design, essentially. And then we're going to intersect it with the map of biodiversity importance. So here we're looking at all imperiled taxa, so all those taxonomic groups, and just see if we can help generate interest in specific areas that we can suggest there is high co-benefits for imperiled species conservation. So we're just going to go to this one little sort of network region, this one little connector that has been identified. And we're literally looking at the map of biodiversity importance results in the rainbow color, and the white being the conservation land network, where we're able to say, hey, there's a lot of imperiled species with remarkable fidelity to the land network. Obviously, this is a riparian corridor. And in this, we can say in this riparian corridor, oh, wow, you have you've got a plant, you got a bat, you've got a couple species of freshwater fishes. Like there are multiple co-occurring imperiled species here, according to the aggregated suitable habitat data that has come out of the map of biodiversity importance. So this is sort of concrete and spatially explicit information that at least you'd want to look for these taxa here, and you may want to see how you can leverage this with the private or public entities that you are working with to try to make landscape conservation happen in your backyard. Here we're going to take a look at Florida. I owed Gary these slides a long time ago. I'm sorry, Gary, but here's a couple of them. And look at the Florida Wildlife Corridor, which is a Florida statewide effort. So everything here in white is sort of landscape conservation design for the state of Florida. And we're going to look at existing protected areas, as well as how the Florida Wildlife Corridor fits. So the dark green being current gap 1 and 2, the white being places where we want to fill in the network of connected and protected core habitats of one of the most biodiverse states in the nation. And we're just going to zoom into the Apalachicola because that place is just lighting up. It's just on fire. So looking at the Apalachicola region, looking at where what the map of biodiversity importance values are, like very high in large parts of this region, and looking at the overlap with the Florida wildlife corridors and just how much coinciding there is there. And we can start to ask ourselves questions about, well, what imperiled species may be in this same area. And that can give us the ammunition that we need sometimes to get extra funding, sometimes incentive for extra private land conservation, and increasingly the business community looking for ways that it can get involved in conservation, and imperiled species conservation being a way that you can really measure your conservation, the benefits that are being delivered by the conservation you're trying to put in place. So my very last example is going to be about national wildlife refuge boundaries and the current ones and their actual acquisition boundaries, and we'll go to the Northeast. So we're looking here at just a few tiny national wildlife refuges in the very northeastern part of our country. But this is actually the acquisition boundary, the entire Connecticut River system that Congress said when it originally put the Silvio Conti National Wildlife Refuge in place. It said, and here's the area that we allow you to continue to keep trying to fill in for to meet your mission of protecting fish and wildlife on behalf of the public trust. And so obviously we're not going to fill in the entire Connecticut River, but we can ask ourselves again, well, what does the map of biodiversity importance say? Where can we get co-benefits for imperiled species conservation? And there's some clear ones that pop out. We can also ask though, and so here we're just thresholding the rainbow, so we can look at another data layer as well, a data layer on climate resilience from the Nature Conservancy. So I'm sure many of you are very well aware of the work by TNC's Eastern Science Division, led by Mark Anderson, now replicated nationally, to come up with resilient lands. So the red here are now the TNC resilient lands. And we can kind of ask, well, where do we have co-occurring multiple conservation benefits being delivered that fall within the acquisition boundary of this particular area? And this is a question that we can ask ourselves these questions anywhere in the lower 48 states right now. So with that, I'm going to leave you with one final map and one final point. One of the things we did in the ecological applications paper was we generated a map of what we called areas of unprotected biodiversity importance. We looked at imperiled species that are range restricted, that fall outside our current GAP 1 and 2 protected areas. And that's what is here in yellow. And then we just, on a whim, we did an analysis of, well, where is the population density in the United States? And so we mapped this according to population density. And the most amazing statistic came out that I think is really relevant to everyone on this call. 90% of the population of the United States lives within 30 miles of an area of unprotected biodiversity importance. Like everyone and anyone can get involved in conserving the natural heritage in our country, and especially the heritage in our country that is closest to oblivion, that is the heritage that we want to protect if we want intact natural landscapes that are functioning and delivering the full suite of values: economic, ecological, cultural, spiritual, moral, the full suite of values that all of us are in this world, this profession of conservation in order to maintain. So with that, here's a slide of a few resources that I will leave up, and I'll take a few questions. Sorry to go a little bit over my 45 minutes there.
Thank you so much, Healy. This has been extremely informative. There's so much information. And also, I've gotten a lot of questions about if we'll have slides and if we'll have more information. We may not get to all the questions, so I'll dive in really quickly here so we can get to some. But our recording will be up, and if you guys want more information, please reach out to us or reach out to Healy with her email right there. But because we only have a little bit of time, I'll ask a few things that have come up in the Q&A, and then I'll try to move to the chat. A question from Abigail Weinberg. Given how much species ranges will change given climate change, would you recommend using ecosystem or species data for landscape conservation targets? And what are the benefits of each?
Wow, Abigail, thanks. Like we could have a whole entire graduate seminar course on trying to answer that question. I mean, species range shift modeling is an important exercise, and yet one that's fraught with uncertainties. And we've done, over my career, I've done a ton of work on climate change impacts to biodiversity that we do for managers and then hand it over to managers. And then their eyes just kind of glaze over and they're like, 2050, what? Like, it just seems too far away. I think it is important for us to be aware of the leading and the losing edges of both species and ecosystem distributions. And that is a very valid and active area of research. I mean, in a perfect world, I would love to be able to incorporate CMIP6 climate change models into, which aren't even totally ready yet, and be able to use our modeling infrastructure to essentially model future distributions for all of these taxa. I really believe in sort of near-term change, like 2020 to 2040 kind of window. The further out you go, the more uncertain things are. And I mentioned here sort of the coarse filter, fine filter. I do believe ecosystem, habitat conservation is that's what we manage. It's often what we protect. And so, understanding those leading and losing edges for both species and ecosystems, yes, but not getting so caught up in the infinite research that you can do that you never get around to on the ground action.
Thank you so much, Healy. We have tons of questions pouring in. So let me get to one more from Sam. Does the data set for protection, weighted range size, rarity take into account the potential lack of data in larger tracts of private land? And there's some spots where private land has a lower value. So this gentleman is really curious about what that looks like and surrounded by public land of higher value. I'm curious to know kind of how that fits in.
So this is actually the biggest criticism that we have gotten so far in publishing a lot of these maps is just how wrong the GAP 1 and 2 protected area data set is. We have gotten phone calls from people saying, like, why do you have this considered protected? You can't believe the stuff they let go on in there. And then we've had calls saying, why isn't my protected area, on your analysis? Like, this is way more protected than some of the areas you're listed as protected. We only were able for this study to use our nation's formal US protected areas database that the USGS maintains. And I'd like to scream from the rooftops right now that all of us should be putting a lot of pressure on the US protected areas database to be as up to date and accurate as possible, because how are we going to do 30 by 30 if we don't? So that's a data set we consumed from the federal government that is apparently full of problems. We don't manage it, and we needed a nationally consistent protected areas data set, and that's the one that we had to go with. But clearly there's a lot of work to be done there. And it's really important work at this point in time.
That's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think there is a couple questions about private land, so really appreciate you discussing that and talking about that. Something a little bit specific of a question, but kind of talking about the management side of this and, who is managing that. You showed a circular pie chart when you're talking about, I think, one of the species, I think in California, and it depicts who does manage the protected areas, or who should be managing the protected areas was one question that Virginia had. So clarifying who does manage versus who should manage. Is it by designation, et cetera?
Yeah, those pie charts are really, they're just intersecting what we are proposing as a species distribution with current land management shapefiles. And so then we're just pulling, well, of all the pixels, how many are BLM, how many are private, how many are, and we can get as fine a resolution as we have underlying data. We are in no way saying who should be managing it, but I'll tell you, there's a lot of conversation right now around the word sort of responsibility species. If 90% of the habitat is on Forest Service land, guess what, Forest Service, you're responsible. And as it turns out, hundreds of unlisted imperiled species occur on Forest Service lands, at least 50% of their modeled habitat or more. And so trying to understand whose jurisdictional responsibility we can't even begin to understand that until we have a robust hypothesis of where it's found. And that has been lacking for so many of these species for too long.
That's great. Thanks so much. Another one, so you did show a great map of historical distribution, specifically for the grasslands. So Julie is wondering, are modeled historical distributions of ecosystems available through the new Explorer site?
You know, it's terrible that I don't actually know if the historical data are up on Explorer right now, or yeah, we have such a push to keep going with Explorer because it, you know, it serves so many needs. And ecosystems data hasn't previously been available. And I think right now it might just be current ecosystems and that we're still working on uploads. And I also forgot to say that what we did for grasslands, we have that for forests, we have it for wetlands, we have it for deserts. So all the major ecosystems of our country, and I just chose grasslands as an example. So you could please write me and I'm happy to try to connect you with that data, but I don't think it is freely available on Explorer yet.
That's great. Yeah, and Virginia or Julie just suggested it may be available on future versions. She checked it out. So, but I think there's a lot of interest because of that dramatic transformation that you showed and how visually compelling that is, and how someone could use that to really tell the story of these imperiled landscapes in addition to the biodiversity value. So that is one big interest. Let me see if we can fit in maybe one more question before we have to start wrapping up. So let's see, we talked about private lands, and then another one came in. So Healy, the map of areas of unprotected biodiversity importance highlights the Apalachicola River Basin in Florida. And a lot of that area is protected for national forest, state forest, TNC properties. Does it show up because NatureServe does not regard those as properties or being fully protected for biodiversity? So I think this is kind of in the similar vein as the GAP 1, GAP 2.
You're right, Kat.
Yeah.
It is. So being on Forest Service land does not automatically make you protected. Most of the Apalachicola is not wilderness or study areas or other, wildlife management areas. So this result is dependent on the USGS, the GAP 1 and 2. We're only looking at GAP 1 and 2 when we make this map. So again, this is the largest weakness so far, is that GAP 1 and 2 layer, which is really the only layer we had to work with. Once you start scrutinizing my favorite pixel, it seems to break down in some places.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. I know we have to slow down and wrap up, but for those who were questions that we didn't get to, as I mentioned, the recording will be up, but please submit questions regardless, because all these questions will go to Dr. Hamilton after the fact. So if we're able to continue to have that conversation, we will make sure that she gets all of these questions. So if we didn't get to it, please submit. So as we're running down, I just wanted to send a big thank you to Dr. Hamilton for letting us really learn from you today. I mean, incredible resources, incredible visuals. I think everyone is extremely excited to dive into all the maps and all the presentation and the graphics that you provided. So this webinar is part of the ongoing Landscape Conservation and Action webinar series. And as I mentioned, a recording of this webinar will be posted on the network's website within the next 48 hours or so. And you can access this webinar and past webinars on our website, and I'll pop the link into the chat right now so everyone can get a direct access to that. And as always, really just appreciate all of the attendance here today and really active participation and questions. We're extremely grateful for all of you coming to the webinar series and your continued engagement and support of the Network for Landscape Conservation. And we really hope that you have a great rest of your day. And thank you again, Healy, for the incredible presentation and allowing us to learn from you. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to continuing the conversations in the coming weeks. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you, Kat.
Thanks, Healy.